Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asoch b'divrei Torah. All right, this week's lesson we'll be looking at the kings of Israel. Last week we looked at some of the the couple of kings from Judah, and so then this week we're going to be looking at 5 kings of Israel that happen to coincide with the 40 years of the reign of King Asa, or Asa, as many of us grew up hearing. That he had roughly a 40-year span to reign in Judah, and so there were like 5 kings that were in Israel at that time. And so, in fact, one of those kings just lasted 1 week, and the pressure of everything was just a little bit too much for him, I guess. So anyway, here we are with our timeline as to where we are in these chapters, and this doesn't change very much. Here we are over in Chronicles. We're probably not going to get into anything in Chronicles tonight, but because it jumps, the Chronicle story jumps right back to Judah and Jehoshaphat. So we'll be looking at that next week. Now, before we actually get going, are there any questions that anyone has or comments on the lesson, on where we're looking at? I did want to ask you, now we've had about 2 or 3 or 4 of these each week. When I start out, we'll have this little moment in time or a slice of time, which kind of talks about some aspect of life in the Iron Age, which is what this is, somewhere between, around 800, 700 BCE. And I try to look at various aspects of life or industry or whatever. And is there a topic that someone would like for me to look at and expand on? If you see something like that, or know of something like that, please let me know, because it might be something that I hadn't really thought about that we would want to look at. Now, next week, I can tell you right now, next week we're going to look at an archaeological dig that around, well, several things, but an archaeological dig that they have in Israel that was an industry during this time, and that was the industry of dyeing cloth. And it's very, very interesting. In the Jewish world, we have these things called tzitzit, and those are the fringes on the corners of our 4-cornered garments if we wear them, or on a talit for Shabbat. And in that, there used to be a blue thread that they would put in there, and that so I don't want to give away too much of what we'll be talking about next week. But anyway, that's what we'll be talking about next week, is the dyeing process, how they did that, what that meant to them in the industry and in the country. And so, but this week now, I'm going to look at another kind of thing that went on during this time, and that is called, we're gonna look at the olive oil production in the Iron Age. Now, one of the prophecies that Moses spoke over the tribes before they entered the Promised Land was that Asher would dip his foot in oil. Now, that does not mean that Israel would be dotted with modern day oil wells. What they were talking about was that olive oil would be an important industry for Israel, and the area that Asher occupied would have its share of olive groves, and so that's what that was talking about. There is oil company over here in the United States that has been drilling in Israel for 30 years and have yet to find any marketable or enough oil in a well to actually make it a producing well. But that was their deal. It was founded by some guy who read this, that Asher would dip his foot in oil, and so he just knew that meant that Israel would turn into an oil producing nation. Well, he was sort of right, except that there's almost no oil. There are a few producing oil wells in Israel, very few. They're mostly up in the Golan, and but if you get offshore, there is oil and there's gas, not much oil, but there is gas, natural gas of, okay, I'll say the pun, of biblical proportions. And so that is going to make, that has been a real boon for Israel's economy, and it's also a way to kind of counteract some of the influence that countries like Russia would have over Europe and other countries, because they could cut off their gas. Well, Israel now has enough that they can export. They're still working on their infrastructure for that, but Israel will have natural gas for generations. So anyway, getting back to the oil and gas. Okay, and here's the area that we're talking about. Again, this is the Israel up here, and then you've got Judah down in this area here. Okay, and the time frame we're looking at roughly 909, somewhere around here, where Baasha, actually even further up here with Nadab, but Baasha, and going all the way down here to Ahab. All right, that's the time frame that we're looking at, and it's mostly all of it in Israel. And during this time, Asa was the king in Judah. So everything in the old days was very labor intensive. They didn't have industrialized anything, and so olive trees actually grow pretty much everywhere in Israel, except for like down in the desert regions. And even then, if you have a wadi that has water in it most of the year, you'll see a few olive trees. But most all of the olive trees are up north, and the olive groves. And what would happen was every October, November, excuse me, the olives are ripe, and so they would go out there in the olive trees, and they would spread cloths on the ground, and then they would take a stick and hit the limbs of the olive trees, and the olives would fall down into the cloths, and then they would pick them up and take them to a mill to be squeezed. And about 20 to 30% of the olive is producible oil. So that's to me, I think that's a lot of oil that you can get out of an olive. And the first presses were just it was basically just a big old weight on wicker baskets full of olives. And so the idea of eating olives and having like an olive salad or making a big muffalata with a lot of olives in there was a much later development, because you cannot eat an olive. You can't just go out and grab an olive and chew on it and eat it. It is so bitter, and it's worse than trying to eat a green persimmon. And they really don't have a whole lot of insect pressure on them, because even a locust won't eat olives. And so the idea of how did they ever figure out how to eat olives? I don't know, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. So let me show you some pictures, and mostly this is just going to be a show and tell tonight with as far as the olive. Now this picture that you see here is obviously it's just a drawing of what the olive press would have looked like, and they have the olives in these wicker baskets, and then they stack the wicker baskets up on top of each other. And this pole here is stuck into a wall, so it's not going to go anywhere. And then they hang these heavy weights, the stone weights, way off here on the back. So basically what it is, it's a lever arm to where the weight is magnified because it's further back from where the weight is pressing down on the baskets. And so what'll happen is, as the oil is squeezed out of the olives, then it goes into this little trough, and then finally into this reservoir down here in the ground, and then they can take and dip that up and put it into jars. Now, a lot of the jars that they had were not particularly having these flat bottoms and so forth, because a lot of the jars had more of a conical bottom, called amphora, and they were that way because then they could put them into ships and into boats, and it wouldn't take up as much room. As a more efficient design for putting the olive jars into boats. And so anyway, this is a drawing of one, and here is an actual one. Well, it's actually a one that they've made up from the ruins of someplace. But you can see here that they've got the a stone, the press. It presses down on these baskets that have olives in them, and then it gets into this trough around here, and then flows into this down here. Now they just got a little hole because in reality you'd have had a much bigger hole so that you could get a container in there and scoop it all up. But you get the idea of what that looked like. Now later on, say 100 BCE, and then up on through the time of Yeshua in the New Testament, they had a little bit better technology than they first did, and they would put the olives here in this depression, and then the burro would go walking around, and that roller, that heavy roller, then would press the olives, and they would get actually it's a little bit more efficient, and it would press the oil out in a much better fashion, faster, much more efficient. But that was pretty much the technology, and it stayed that way for a long time. In fact, there are still places where remote little backwaters that might even have one of these someplace. But for the most part, olives are just gathered today, and they take them off to a processing plant, and that's where they render the oil from them. Now, in Ekron, there was a city in Israel called Ekron, and they had actually, it was very industrialized in the terms of the olives and their production. So you can see here, this is like they have several presses here, and all these jars. You'll see down here the jars are conical at the bottom, and that's what I said. They're called amphora, and so this is just, again, an artist's concept of what the ruins might have told us. So now here's an olive lamp from the time frame that we're talking about, around 1000 BCE, 900, 800 BCE. And all it was is just kind of a little, well, it kind of looks like a thick tortilla that they picked up one corner of it and kind of squeezed it together, and then they would lay a wick right here in this area here, depression, and then they would put oil in it later on. Now we have over here, if my lovely assistant here would get me the lamp that's on the top shelf there, we have a more modern rendition of it that looks kind of like this, okay? And it's so, all right, real modern, touristy, they put a little candle wick inside like that. But no, in real life, back in the day, you would have had a wick that would come out here, and then you just pour the oil into this thing here, and you could carry it around like this, and put it up on a shelf, a rock shelf inside your home, and it would give out light. And we have even made I've even made olive oil lamps to use as emergency lamps that just in a glass jar that you make it to where it'll have a wick in it, and you can light that off. And the good thing about it is, if for some reason the olive oil were to the lamp were to fall over, break, or something like that, it would not flare up and burn like a say a kerosene lamp would do. And so, they didn't give out the light that a kerosene lamp would, but still, it was safe. And now here's the oldest tree in Israel. Okay, some say it's about 5,000 years old, and so if you go to Gethsemane, there are some old trees there. I mean, there are some trees that they say were there from the time of Yeshua. So those trees would have been over 2,000 years old. But old just looks like dead bark stuff there. But there's greenery coming out the top, and they're still producing a few olives. And now here's what here is a modern olive grove in Israel. What did you say? Yeah, Pat was saying that the branches come up from just the middle or all over, those old dead trunks. You just think, my gosh, how could you ever have anything live out of that? But they do. They just keep on keeping on. All right, so there's that. All right, now any comments or questions on olives? That's probably more than you ever wanted to know about olives. Okay. And like I said, next week we'll be talking about the textile dyeing industry, not the dyeing textile industry, but the textile dyeing industry of ancient Middle East, and what it meant to them. All right, so looking at let's see, just another few things on my notes. Israel today has around 81,000 acres of olive groves, and they produce around 16,000 tons of extra virgin olive oil every year. And most of the oil Israel produces is for domestic use, while about 1,000 tons is exported mainly to the United States. And by comparison, just as a comparison, Spain, which produces 44% of all of the world's olive oil, and that totals about 1.2 million tons of oil every year. So, when it gets down to it, Israel is a small player. Another interesting fact: the traditional Arab olive oils that they have, there's basically two kinds, and I couldn't pronounce them, and so certainly can't remember but they are more of a very pungent and maybe a peppery taste to them, whereas the olive oil that Israel generally grown in Israel is much more for the Western palate. It's a smoother thing, so what we're used to here in the United States, that kind of olive oil. So, all right, so maybe that was even a little bit more than you wanted to know about olives. All right, so let's go ahead with our study. In the third year of King Assad, and what I'm doing is, in fact, let me back up a little bit even more to give you a little bit more of a flavor for this. In 1 Kings 15, we left off last week, 1 Kings 15 and 24, and with the Asa coming to power, and they talk about him a little bit. So this is now in Israel, the northern tribes. You had Nadab, son of Jeroboam, who began to reign over Israel in the second year of the reign of Judah, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. And he did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, walking in the way of his father and in his sins that he caused Israel to commit. So then Baasa, son of Ahiah, of the house of Issachar, conspired against him. Baasa then struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, when Nadab and all of Israel were besieging Gibbethon. So there are some that say that possibly that he had him killed or killed him in the thick of battle, so that then he came to power. So Baasa slew him in the third year of King Asa of Judah, and became king in his place. How that happened, I don't know, other than just maybe killing the guy and just said, okay, now I'm the king. As soon as he became king, he went through and struck down all of the household of Jeroboam. Now, he didn't spare Jeroboam anything with breath until he had destroyed him, just as the word of Adonai that he spoke by the hand of his servant Ahiah the Shilonite, because of the sins of Jeroboam had committed and caused Israel to commit, by which he utterly provoked Adonai, God of Israel. Now the rest of the deeds of Nadab and all he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Now that's a line that you'll see over and over and over again. And then we see that there was war between Asa, and King Baasa of Israel, their entire reign, the entire time that Baasa was in Israel. Asa in Judah, they fought. And so what did that do? That really just reduced the resources of both countries, to the point then that Judah was unable to defend itself when Egypt came up and raided a bunch of their towns and took a bunch of stuff out of the temple and so forth. And then Damascus and that area of the north, then they were also subject to predation, because they were not strong enough, because they'd been fighting each other this whole time. All right. And so we see that Baasa, he reigned 24 years total, and he killed all of Nadab's heirs, all of the family, but he did not return to the worship of Adonai. He went in the same way that Jeroboam had done, and he basically followed all the cultish worship that was established by Jeroboam. And this it's just a story that is repeated over and over and over again. And there's nothing, I guess you just look at it and you say, how can these guys be so arrogant and stupid, I guess you'd say, when God kept telling them because you are not worshiping me, and that you're worshiping all of these false gods, these idols and stuff like that, that I'm going to keep, I'm going to keep punishing you. So no one is going to have a big long reign, with his sons, his grandsons, his whatever, because you guys are not behaving yourself. And every single one, they'd get a prophecy like that, but they would keep on going and doing what they wanted to do. So each one of these times when the a new king comes up, and then he goes back and kills all the family of the old one, which was, yeah, that was a typical thing that happened back during the days of, that time frame. So it wasn't totally unexpected. I mean, nobody was shocked over that kind of behavior, but that's what did happen. And so you'd think of it that every time it did happen, basically that was God saying, "See, I told you, if you would just behave yourself, then you wouldn't have these problems." So, um, going on with this, looking at Kings, well, last two verses in chapter 15. Baasa's in the third year of King Assad of Judah, Baasa killed, son of Ahiah, began to reign over all of Israel in Tirzah, reigning 24 years. Now, he did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, and followed the way of Jeroboam and the sin that he had made Israel commit. So Baasa had a 24-year reign from 909 to 886 BCE, and that's the third longest reign of any of the kings of the northern kingdom. And it fell totally within the range of the rule of Asa over in Judah, which was from 911 to 870. So he had got a 41 year reign, and this guy only had 24. The Israelite king who had the longest reign, of course, was Jeroboam the second, and he had 41 years. And the second longest was Jehu, and he had or Jehu, he had 28 years. So Baasa, he had an excellent opportunity to lead Israel back to true covenantal worship after he killed Nadab and he terminated Jeroboam's dynasty. However, he chose not to. And we knew that was coming already. He evidently regarded his rise from a lowly origin. I mean, he was just like, a servant's kid, or you might say, he started life as a sharecropper's kid or something, really low down in the social uh, order, and yet then he was able to rise up and become a king of Israel. And so he just figured that he could do all of that that he wanted to, and he didn't have to follow God. So and because of this, though, God said, "All right, I'm going to cut off his line as he had with Jeroboam's." And God ended Baasa's reign basically for two reasons: his continuation of Jeroboam's cultish worship, and the motive and manner in which he assassinated Nadab, Jeroboam's son. So that's what God said. That's why you're going to lose your throne. 1 Kings 16, 1 through 4. Now the word of Adonai came to Jehu, son of Hanani, against Baasa, saying, since I raised you up from the dust and made you ruler over my people Israel, yet you have walked in the way of Jeroboam and have caused my people Israel to sin, vexing me with their sins. I am about to consume Baasa and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Uh, anyone of Baasa who dies in the city, the dogs will eat, and anyone who dies in the field, the birds of the sky will eat. The vultures will eat him. So Jehu, a prophet, he was also the son of a prophet, and he's mentioned in Second Chronicles 20:34 as being the author of a history. So he wrote a book that was inserted into the King of Kings. So some of this stuff may have been his. Some of the writings in First and Second Kings may very well have been authored by Jehu, the prophet. So now this same prophet, he moved to Jerusalem, and you'll find that in Second Chronicles 16. We'll see that next week, where he prophesied under Jehoshaphat. He was the I guess you could say the court prophet at that time, who actually he came up against Jeroboam or against Jehoshaphat at one point, and he rebuked him for something that he did. And again, we'll talk about that next week. So he must have lived a long time. He was a very long-lived prophet because he wrote about Jehoshaphat's life. All right. The prophecy that was um, over Jeroboam, over Baasa, was very, very similar to this. It's almost, kind of word for word over the same one that was given over Jeroboam. Baasa and Jeroboam had the same prophecy over them, basically, because you won't worship me properly and you're doing idolatry and a bunch of nasty stuff. And causing Israel to follow you in this, then that's the end of your kingdom, and that's the end of your line of things. So, okay, so then going on to First Kings, um, 1 Kings 16:5-7. Now the rest of the deeds of Asa and what he did and his might, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And how about going and Patricia and opening that gate door or something? Just well, yeah, you can hear it on my microphone. Yes. Anyway, um, so then verse 6, when Baasa slept with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah, and his son Elah became king in his place. But the word of Adonai had already come by the hand of the prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, against Baasa, against his house, because all of the evil he had done in Adonai's eyes, vexing him with the work of his hands, becoming thus like the house of Jeroboam, which he struck down. Okay. So we don't know a lot about Baasa other than I mean, what's written, what I've just read tonight. That the very fact that he continued in Jeroboam's sin and caused the illegal worship to be perpetuated, it clearly showed enough, though, that in his exterminating of Jeroboam's family and so forth, that he did not act under divine direction. He was just he was like all the kings of Israel, just a self-serving guy that he pursued his everything just for his own benefit. So he started out as an evil king. 24 years later, when he died, he was still an evil king. So that's just a story that really goes on throughout all of Israel. And going ahead with verse 8 here in the I'll read on through the 14th. In the 26th year of King Assad of Judah, Elah, son of Baasa, became king over Israel in Tirzah, and he reigned 2 years. Then his servant Zimri, commander of half his chariotry, conspired against him while he was in Tirzah, making himself drunk in the house of Arza, who was in charge of the palace in Tirzah. when Zimri went in, struck him down, killed him in the 27th year of King Assad of Judah, and became king in his place. Again, I guess, going on. And it came about that he became king as soon as he sat on the throne. He struck down all the house of Baasa, leaving him not even one man, nor his kinsman, nor his friends. So Zimri destroyed the entire house of Baasa, according to the word of Adonai, which he spoke against Baasa by the prophet Jehu, for all of the sins of Baasa and the sins of his son Elah, which they committed and caused Israel to commit, vexing Adonai, God of Israel, with their useless idols. A little bit of editorializing in there, but that's okay. Now the rest of the deeds of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel? All right, so that closes out. Elah, and we see the introduction of Zimri, who, again, he was not of any kind of a royal, highfalutin family or anything. He was a soldier. He was in charge of half of the chariots, and so that made him a pretty high-ranking officer. But still, the King Elah, who only lasted a couple of years. He got drunk, and that made it very easy for Zimri then to come in and assassinate him. And then, again, I don't know the mechanism of how they then declared themselves king by just killing the old king, but somewhere along the line that's how they did that. That's how it worked. And so if we go ahead, and I'm going to read on through to verse 20. In the 27th year of King Assad of Judah, Zimri reigned for 7 days in Tirzah. Now the people were encamped against Gibbethon of the Philistines. When the people encamped heard of it, Zimri has conspired and even struck down the king. Then all Israel proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, as king over Israel that very day in camp. Then Omri and all Israel with him went up from Gibbethon and besieged Tirzah. When Zimri saw that the city was captured, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and burned down the royal palace over him with fire. So he died too, because of the sins which he committed, doing that was evil in Adonai's eyes, walking in the way of Jeroboam, and in the sin which he had committed, making Israel sin. Now the rest of the deeds of Zimri and his treason, what he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Now, this guy Zimri, he killed the king, and so then what happened was the children of Israel were at the Gibbethon. Okay, now that is a place, and I've already read that. Here's the map of it. Okay, Tirzah was where the palace was. That's where they were ruling from and had been for 40 years. And this down here is Gibbethon. Okay, now this had been you can see that it had been in Israel's territory, but the Philistines had kind of encroached on that and captured it, and so now they were trying to capture it back. And you can see how it all kind of melts together in there. It's a real tight. Everything is on the border here. And then you can also this right here, it says that you can see Jerusalem, not too far away, but that's where they were. Israel had gone against Gibbethon, and they had all their army and everything there. So then, when they decided that, when they heard that Zimri had killed Elah and had declared himself king, well, these people decided, oh, no, 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 we're going to make our own king. I mean, our own general, the king. And so we've already got our army together. So they left the siege of Gibbethon, and then went up to Tirzah and surrounded the city. All right. And, it was pretty easy because they had all of their army there. So there was really nothing that Zimri could do at that point. And so he committed suicide and burned the palace down around his ears. And so I guess if he figured if he couldn't have the palace, then no one else would. And so then that eventually ended up meaning that they built a different palace over in Samaria, and that became the head of government at that point. All right, comments, questions? Okay. Then looking at verse 21, then the people of Israel were divided into two factions. Half of the people followed Tibni of Ganath, making him king, and the other half followed Omri. But the people following Omri prevailed against the people following Tibni, son of Ganath. Tibni died, and Omri became king. All right, now that just kind of goes to show you the turmoil that was Israel at that time. I mean, it was just so unstable that even though Omri had gone up with the army, the rest of Israel, half of the rest of Israel, looked at this and said, "Nah, that's not the way. We don't want him. We want this guy Tibni." And so evidently, then they fought. Tibni was killed, and so then Omri was able to take full control. And that's in the slide. There should be Omri, not Omni. Okay. Then going on in the 31st year of the king Assad of Judah, Omri began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 12 years, 6 years in Tirzah. Then he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver, and he built a city on the hill. He named that city that he built Samaria based on the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. But Omri did what was evil in Adonai's eyes and acted more wickedly than all who were before him, for he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and in the sins that he had caused Israel to commit, vexing Adonai, king of Israel, with their useless idols. Again, coming along and talking about their useless idols. So what we see here, Omri, he had bought that land. He had actually then established the eventual capital of Israel there in Samaria. But he continued on with everything that Jeroboam did, and the Bible clearly says that he did so much. I mean, he did stuff that was even worse than everybody else did, and so he was just a bad king for all of Israel. So, and then it goes on and says, now the rest of the deeds of Omri that he did and the valiant deeds that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria. Then his son Ahab became king in his palace. Okay, so what we have now is the Ahab coming to power, and of course we've all heard of Ahab and Jezebel, and so I didn't want to get into them tonight because we want to give it full shrift there with all that Ahab did, and his not so lovely wife Jezebel, and how they interacted with Isaiah and Jeremiah, and the Isaiah, I guess it was,